Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Habush-Plunkett, Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to Day 2 of Illustration and Race, Rethinking the History of Published Imagery. The Norman Rockwell Museum's current exhibition, Imprinted, Illustrating Race, examines more than 300 years of racial representation. And we'll begin our program this morning with a series of concise but very compelling presentations by exhibition advisors, catalog authors, and lenders. Their research focuses on historical representations of race in the press and in popular culture that established a sense of American nationalism for white audiences through the subjugation of Indigenous, Black, and Asian people and cultures. Robin Phillips Pendleton and I have been grateful for the guidance and expertise that each of our panelists has provided throughout the exhibition planning process. They have been tremendous supports to us, and it is now my great pleasure to introduce them. I'd also, before doing that, just like to thank Rich Bradway and Ellen Gorman, who are working in the background to ensure that everything works technologically well. And I'd also like to invite you, as we go through the presentations, to place questions and comments in the Q&A. And when each of the presentations is completed, we will bring everyone back and look forward to having a conversation. Heather Campbell Coyle is Curator of American Art at the Delaware Art Museum. Howard Pyle, American Master Rediscovered, Fashion Circus Spectacle, photographs by Scott Heiser, and An American Journey, The Art of John Sloan, are among her many exhibitions. She is co-editor and co-author of John Sloan's New York, and she is currently working on an exhibition of Jazz Age illustration for the Delaware Art Museum. Karen Fang is professor in the Department of English at the University of Houston. A film scholar whose research explores the intersection of Eastern and Western aesthetics, she's the author of Arresting Cinema, Surveillance in Hong Kong Film, and a contributor to The Engines of Our Ingenuity, a public radio series about science and technology to which she adds arts commentary. She's currently at work on a biography of Chinese-American illustrator Tyrus Wong, who was instrumental in the production of the beloved Disney classic Bambi. Michelle Bogart is Professor Emeritus of Art History and Visual Culture Studies at Stony Brook University. She has published on public art, memorials, animation, landscape and garden history, photography, illustration, and advertising. And she's the author of Public Sculpture and the Civic Ideal in New York City, 1890 to 1930, Artists, Advertising, and the Borders of Art, The Politics of Urban Beauty, New York and its Art Commission, and Sculpture in Gotham, Art and Urban Renewal in New York. Teresa Leininger Miller is Professor of Art History at the University of Cincinnati, where she teaches 19th to 21st century American and European art history. New Negro Artists in Paris, African American Painters and Sculptors in the City of Light, 1922 to 1934, Paris Connections, African American Artists in Paris, Women Artists of the Harlem Renaissance, Out of Context, American Artists Abroad, and The Modern Woman Revisited, Paris Between the Wars, are among her many publications. Leonard Davis is a fashion designer, fashion event producer, educator, and Black Americana collector. He began his career as an apprentice to Jean-Louis Scherer in Paris before returning to New York, where he created designs for Willie Wear and other companies. Leonard was the first African-American designer to head divisions at Adriana Papel, Josephine Chouse, and Don Kenny. He's developed private labels at Liz Claiborne, QVC, Essence by Mail, international fashion houses, and such retail stores as Nordstrom, Macy's, and Bloomingdale's. In 1985, he began collecting Black Americana and is the author of the Black Americana Price Guide, which actually has 2 editions. He also teaches courses at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, And what a group. We are so excited to welcome you all. We're actually going to begin with Heather Campbell Coyle. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here.
This project started with conversations with the curators, Stephanie and Robin, about works that we might lend from the collection of the Delaware Art Museum, where I work, in particular with these 4 works by Howard Pyle. For anybody who doesn't know, the Delaware Art Museum was founded with a collection of Howard Pyle's work, and about 1/3 of our permanent collection is classified as American illustration. Out of over 4,000 illustrations in the museum's collection, we've identified less than 100 works representing African or African American people. In the case of Pyle, out of hundreds of finished illustrations at the museum, we have these 4. And the images really run the gamut in subject and style. There's a sensitive portrait of a specific individual, which you see on the left, Samuel Nimmey. There is a racist caricature produced for a children's magazine. And there are 2 historical subjects where Black figures are central to the story and the image. I set out to figure out if these images and their relative rarity were typical of Pyle and of the illustrated periodicals of the late 19th century. So I went through the entire catalog raisonné for Pyle, and sure enough, there are fewer than 80 illustrations where Black figures can be clearly identified, and the majority of these are historical subjects, whether fiction or nonfiction. And then I spent many hours going through the major periodicals where Pyle illustrated: Harper's Monthly, Scribner's, Century, Harper's Young People, St. Nicholas, basically the main literary magazines of the period. I felt the need to sift through all this material because I know there are illustrators like Arthur B. Frost, who, by the way, was Pyle's best man at his wedding, who were prolific creators of racist caricature. I like to count things also. So I made crazy spreadsheets, first by hand and then on Excel, trying to enumerate depictions of race in these magazines. I added categories as I noticed things, and I learned interesting things by doing this survey. Returning to these piles, one of the main places you'll find African and African American and Asian figures actually is in travel literature in this period. And by the way, the American South was actually treated like a foreign country worthy of travel logs at the time. The illustration at the left, Uncle Sam, reflects that strain of writing. Racist cartoons did appear in literary magazines, though only rarely and certainly not every month. And finally, history. This is a period when American readers and writers were fascinated with American history generally, especially the colonial and Revolutionary War era, and African Americans are part of that history and appeared in stories of it, as you see represented in the 2 images to the right. Ultimately, I decided to focus on colonial and revolutionary history pictures because this is one of Howard Pyle's specialties. In particular, Pyle was hired to depict dramatic moments that helped readers connect emotionally with people and events of the past. Here, he's captured the drama of the Boston Massacre, one of the events that launched the Revolutionary War. In his depiction of the massacre, Pyle placed in a central place Crispus Attucks, the sailor and dock worker of African and Wampanoag descent, who is generally identified as the first casualty of the Boston Massacre. The line of the British officers' rifles and the outstretched arm of the man holding Attucks draw attention to the Black figure. Pyle was known for his accuracy with historical details, his attention to primary sources as well. He would research the setting, the weapons, the uniforms. As part of his research for this illustration, Pyle almost certainly looked at the Paul Revere print of the Boston Massacre. You can see its influence in the massing of figures and buildings, although Pyle has zoomed in closer to elevate the human drama. The Revere print is also an interesting source because Crispus Attucks is included, but he's pushed to the side and his face is actually upside down. Obviously, Pyle posed Attucks in a completely different way, making him a focus. To me, Attucks' pose clearly referenced the famous painting by Benjamin West, The Death of General Wolfe, a fascinating work that I do not have time to talk about today. However, whether or not the West painting was indeed in Pyle's mind, the illustrator's choice of pose makes Attucks a heroic figure as West had made wolf, dying for his cause, surrounded by supportive compatriots. So I immediately connected the Revere print and the West painting to Pyle's Boston Massacre, thanks to my sort of traditional art historical training from the 1990s, training that has a lot of limitations. Further research made me realize that Pyle's depiction of addicts likely drew on popular abolitionist imagery made and circulated during the illustrator's childhood. Abolitionist works from the 1850s, like this chromolithograph, place addicts truly at the center and large, and more individualized. And I think this frontispiece for William Nell's anti-slavery book, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, probably has the strongest resonance with Pyle's composition, as you see for the posing of addicts here. Pyle could have been familiar with these works because he was raised in what I would call an abolitionist context. Pyle was raised in Delaware, a border state that included significant numbers of enslavers and anti-slavery activists. Pyle's particular community was pro-union. He lived in the northern part of the state, and his extended family was largely Quaker. In addition to Pyle's upbringing as a resource for abolitionist imagery, the author of the story, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, was a committed anti-slavery organizer who headed up the South Carolina Volunteers, a Black regiment during the Civil War. So it's possible the idea to include addicts came from him, although he's not mentioned in the text. While Pyle's Boston Massacre illustration was the earliest work I addressed in my essay, and the one I researched the most, my thinking was actually sparked by Pyle's illustrations for New York Slave Traders, a historical account by Thomas Janvier. These were the illustrations where I first noticed Pyle putting Black figures at the emotional and physical center of his history illustrations. Within a much larger essay, Janvier recounted the story of the first slave ship to arrive in New York in 1655, and his brief account inspired two of Pyle's three illustrations, the ones you see here. At the left, you see Pyle's depiction of the first slave auction in New York. At the center, an African man stripped to the waist stands elevated above a crowd, while next to him, a rather pompous-looking white man in a velvet doublet and crisp ruff auctions away his life. The African, while slender, is muscled, and his expression is stoic as he looks out at the reader. The knowing expression of a Rembrandtesque figure in the foreground invites the reader to consider the historical weight of what's happening, the introduction of the institution of slavery in New York. In the illustration at the right, a newly enslaved woman has collapsed as she's led away from the slave auction. Bystanders suggest she is just drunk, but the author tells us that she died later that night. Her exposed skin demonstrates her vulnerability, but her hands are balled into fists as she struggles to stay alive. Pyle was famous for selecting dramatic moments like these, telling his students to picture the supreme moment in order to connect emotionally with the reader. And for Pyle, this connection was the highest aim of illustration. The introduction of enslavement in the Americas was a topic that Pyle returned to in 1901, when he illustrated Woodrow Wilson's Colonies and Nation, A Short History of the People of the United States, which was serialized in Harper's before being released as a book. In this image here, you see Pyle's depiction of emaciated Black figures massed together, seated and kneeling on the ground, in the middle ground. Note the stark contrast between the well-dressed sailors and colonists and the unclothed enslaved people, the armed and unarmed. Pyle has elaborated the draped fabric on the white men, and they are just bristling with weapons. The barrels and the port setting also remind us that these huddled figures were part of a brutal trade-based economic system. I don't know how much of this Pyle thought out. Apparently, according to his letters, he met with Wilson in person to talk about the illustrations, so we don't have letters between them, much to my disappointment. But the illustrator clearly worked through the composition. The museum has his sketches, which you see here, working out how he would arrange the figures. And he landed on an arrangement of figures that draws our eyes to the enslaved men that look out of the reader at the reader, creating an emotional connection. Notably, this image, identified in the caption as a scene from 1619, is the first illustration in Wilson's article, indeed the first in his book. emphasizing the significance of this moment for the entire future of American history. The author actually broke from his narrative to call this out, writing, "Their coming was the beginning of a great change, which was slowly, very slowly, to alter the whole face of society in the settlements." And this wasn't just the first illustration in one article. It appeared as the frontispiece to Harper's in January of 1901, the beginning of a new century. For Wilson, Pyle, and other Americans who had lived through the Civil War, the significance of 1619 was never in doubt. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, for those really fascinating perspectives and for your support throughout this process. The artworks that have been loaned from the Delaware Art Museum have been so important to the exhibition, both the historical works that Heather was just describing, as well as some important mid-century artworks as well. We now go to Karen Fang, and the title of Karen's essay for the catalog that we did was "Who Has the Right Face for America? Asian and Black Stereotypes from the 19th Century to Today," and she'll be talking about that. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Stephanie and Robin and everyone at the Rockwell. I so love working with all of you. When I was invited to contribute an essay to the Imprinted catalog, I felt privileged to have this opportunity to shed light on Asian stereotypes and representation. In the past few years, we've witnessed significant progress in the rejection and correction of African American stereotypes. These changes, long overdue, are heartening, but they've also come at a time when the COVID-19 pandemic has inflamed Asian stereotypes that have also long been part of American visual culture. And this is obviously a very egregious example of the kind of stereotypes, but what you see, it's a very topical cartoon about the pandemic, but you see the cartoon using very long-standing conventions or popular notions of Chinese food as being weird, exotic, of unknown origin, and food sources, and possibly prepared in unsanitary conditions, making people being therefore unhealthy. In my short time today, I'd like to explore this history of Asian American visual stereotypes. Both similar and different from African American stereotypes, Asian American visual stereotypes are also a sad part of American history that tells us about how illustration has been used to construct and enforce establishment notions of race and belonging. And it's this notion of belonging I'd like you to particularly think about. Let's start with this contrast of Asian and Black stereotypes. I apologize for reproducing this unsavory image, but it reminds us of the simian imagery often used to dehumanize African Americans. During slavery, such images try to naturalize that unnatural institution. But in equating human bodies to imported chattel, the images never question those subjects' presence in the US. By contrast, Asian laborers originally brought to the US to build the railroads are portrayed as a pestilence, a horde of insects that will exhaust rather than add to American resources. So you have brute power that can be harnessed for American use versus the locusts that are going to come and decimate American wealth. Like African Americans, Asian immigrants are dehumanized because they aren't white, but the metaphors and visual motifs by which they are dehumanized are different. Where Blacks are subjugated into American power, Asian immigrants are perpetual foreigners from which the US must be cleansed. This history of Asian American representation has three important moments. First, the time of the previous image is the era surrounding Chinese exclusion, of which I'll say more in a moment. The second is World War II, and then the era after the 1965 Immigration Act. Regarding Chinese exclusion, it's telling how few people today even know much about it. In 1882, the US government passed the first of a series of laws that severely restricted Chinese immigration. It was one of the most overt of many US state and federal laws that deprived Asians of basic rights and made Chinese the first population whose immigration was specifically restricted by the US. It also coincidentally made the US the first nation in the world to specifically restrict a population based on race. So before Nazi Germany. On the right is a typical image of the era. I discuss this image in greater detail in my catalog essay. So my point today is simply that such images have consequences. Obviously, they helped drive the legal support for legal codification of exclusion. More generally, they inflamed anti-Chinese sentiment that resulted in lynching, arson, robbery and harassment, and family separation. So this history is not widely known, but there were, in the years leading up to exclusion, there were numerous lynchings and physical attacks, seizures of property, and arsons, burning down of childhood throughout Chinatowns throughout the Western and Mountain states. Ultimately, that led to the creation of Angel Island, the Pacific Immigration Center, which was really designed to detain Asian immigrants. Some of this changed when the US entered war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, ethnic Japanese were public enemy #1, but the US impulse to insist on ethnic Asians as foreigners, regardless of their citizenship or years in the US, underwrote federal action to forcibly send Japanese Americans to internment camps. And I'm sure many of you watching recognize the creator of these images, which is Theodore Geisel or Dr. Seuss. And here are the internment camps. And one of the things that I find so tellingly ironic and cruelly ironic about these images is you can see how not only does like the anxiety of the yellow peril compel the US to start internment, but also the irony that the US then begins engaging in precisely the actions, i.e. the forced movement of populations by race that they were fighting in the European theater. In 1965, President Johnson's Immigration and Naturalization Act brought major improvement in the political rights of Asian Americans, but their cultural image remained ambiguous. This is Johnson signing the act on Liberty Island. The Hart-Celler Law, otherwise known as the 1965 Immigration Law, which is when my father was able to enter the US, opened up US immigration for highly trained professionals and others seeking higher education. This is when the model minority stereotype started of high achieving Asians competing with other Americans in classroom and at the office. It's important here to note that while the model minority label seems outwardly positive, it's still a stereotype with underlying aspects of fear and superiority. For example, look at this 21st century cartoon, which contrasts Chinese pre-professional focus with the frivolous concerns of American, which is to say non-Asian youth. So you can see here the Chinese brain, Chinese adolescents, their brains are filled with math, science, finance, languages, research and development, while the American kids are thinking about texting, celebrities, tweets, and tattoos. The cartoon seems to acknowledge Asian merit and disparage American behaviors, but there's nothing flattering, I'd suggest, about this rather ungainly profile. Indeed, that cartoon isn't much different from this notorious 1941 Life magazine piece, which appeared 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. These illustrations claim to provide reliable racial attributes by which people can distinguish Chinese allies from Japanese enemies. That argument is obviously fallible, but the argument is further problematic for equating ethnicity with villainy. So where are we now? Even before the pandemic, China's rising geopolitical power has triggered new anxieties and stereotypes. With the pandemic, longstanding notions of Asian bodies as a pestilence that must be forcibly expelled from American life have revived anti-Asian violence that has always been part of American history. So what can we do? Earlier, I mentioned how few people know about Chinese exclusion. American anti-Asian history and policy was unjust both for its actual discriminatory policies and because it was so effective at recasting Asian immigrants as perpetual foreigners that our history and presence is often invisible. So I'm sure many of you, again, watching may recognize this widely reproduced image, of the nailing of the Golden Spike, which is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? This iconic image from American westward expansion and manifest destiny. Famously or notoriously, not a single Chinese person is visible in this mass photo. So the very people who made possible the Transcontinental Railroad are not acknowledged in the celebratory scene. And again, sort of injury against injury, you'll note that the title of the image is called East and West Shaking Hands at the Laying of the Last Rail. And so this phrase of East and West, which is so often used to talk about the two hemispheres, the two cultures meeting, right? In this case, means only the meeting of the two railroads. So a further illusion of the laborers who made that possible. But precisely because America has long tried to erase ethnic Asians from our national history and identity, visual representation is a powerful means of combating anti-Asian hate. This is by Jonathan Chang, an LA graphic designer, who's been drawing the victims of anti-Asian violence and sharing them for free on social media. I couldn't figure out how to save a GIF, but this is actually a GIF, and that's actually of the grandmother in San Francisco who was grabbed some nearby 2x4 when she was attacked and actually beat her assailant. These are posters by Amanda Pingbata-Pakia, New York artist in residence, Amanda Pingbata-Pakia, which were often placed in sites where anti-Asian attacks took place. But if there's one thing we've learned through the recent rethinking of African-American visual representation, it's that oppression isn't always as overt as stereotype, and allyship requires a sophisticated understanding of the many ways in which images can debase and diminish. It's easy to condemn images like this, but we need to remember that there are people and bodies affected by even this seemingly non-pictorial verbal gag. So let me leave you with this tweet, which complains about a common tendency in stock photo illustration from the past 2 years. So why does Phil Yu, Angry Asian Man, a well-known social media presence, why is he telling people to stop using photos of masked Asians for your COVID messaging? Think about it. Illustration is powerful and can be used for both positive and negative purposes. As we continue to refine our understanding and approach to racial representation and visual imagery, we need to be aware of the many ways in which all races are used and misused. Thank you.
Karen, thank you so much for those important perspectives and for a fascinating talk. Karen is seen there, by the way, in one of our galleries here at the Norman Rockwell Museum. Even though she's not here right now, she's seen in the Imprinted exhibition, but we did have the opportunity to see her at the opening, which was wonderful. So,
and always with you in spirit.
I know that. We appreciate that, believe me. Thank you so much. Next up is Michelle Bogart, who will be speaking about artwork and the Cream of Wheat campaign, 1895 to 1930. And I'll just be sharing her PowerPoint, so I'll get that up right now.
Right. And forgive me for, I have to wave my fingers around. I have technology challenges with an iPad. Okay.
Okay. We are ready to go. Thank you.
Okay, so you can go to the next one to start. Thank you.
Great.
My catalog essay for Imprinted on the first 25 years of the breakfast food Cream of Wheat around 1900 seeks to show that imagery that's on the one hand understood as racist from our vantage point is also art and socially historically significant. I began the study planning to investigate how an ad campaign showcasing illustration paintings as art came about. I hope to learn how the artists were commissioned and whether the practice was a new procedural departure. Lack of evidence forced me to switch focus. The project thus also highlights the challenges of undertaking this kind of research on advertising designs, process, and patronage but also the potential that exists for unanticipated insights. I show how Cream of Wheat advertising director Emery Mapes exploited the authority associated with fine art, along with a popular and congenial brand trademark, to sell Cream of Wheat cereal and carve out an influential new path in advertising. Key to that enterprise was a Black brand mascot, a chef disparagingly dubbed Rastus. You see him here. Cream of Wheat advertisements and the Black chef were once a familiar sight. The cook became increasingly controversial, as with Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's, whose success hinged on conspicuous display of smiling and servile African-American help. In the wake of the racial reckonings of 2020, Quaker Oats retired the image of Aunt Jemima, and Cream of Wheat soon followed suit. The inherent racism of the advertising mascot and its sales intent cannot be ignored, and observers who focus on the racial justice dimensions of Cream of Wheat advertisements may thus reasonably see the chef advertising images as being, in effect, all alike. But I argue the artwork as both image and labor mattered also. Each advertising picture was very different. Mapes, the CEO, hired prominent magazine illustrators to develop pictures that would command attention and associate the brand with the notion of quality and distinction. Each of the paintings or drawings revealed on an aesthetic level then an individual artist's unique contributions. Crafted through visible marks of the painter-draftsman invention, honed through fine arts training, each picture offered insights into how illustrators labored. The Cream of Wheat company would not have made the investment that it did in the wide array of single paintings were the distinctions among them individually not meant to matter. The Cream of Wheat company's showcasing of fine art methods and labor circa 1900, highlighting the prestige of painting as signifier for product quality, was path-breaking and fairly exceptional for its time. My historical approach sought to distinguish the emotions that now color many people's responses to these images from the motivations at play in the past. I failed to realize my goals of uncovering much information about the specific operations of the Cream of Wheat campaign. Manuscripts and archival evidence simply didn't exist. Thus, part of my analysis centered on the difficulty of finding source material. These obstacles impelled me to focus on the second visible part of the equation and to examine how a group of select artworks for advertising worked semiotically, symbolically, to sell the product. So I'm going to summarize a few examples here. The earliest Cream of Wheat ads, circa 1893 to 1900, experimented with choice of font size, logo, the image of the chef, and packaging. Some of the earliest used the popular poster style with its heavy outlines, bold graphics, bright color, and minimal text. By 1906, the company had developed a full-blown enterprise coalescing around art in advertising. It situated the boldly painted picture style being used by editorial and fiction illustrators as the core of the undertaking. The venture also relied upon intersecting themes revolving around the Cream of Wheat shipping crate. I don't have time to show you those, but the shipping crate, product packaging, and the image of the chef. It also centered on the fame of the Black chef. That thematic focus in turn intersected with Cream of Wheat promotions that built tongue-in-cheek upon then current debates about billboard advertising, and I'll elaborate momentarily. These overlapping motifs all depended for their appeal and effectiveness upon illustrators' artwork, far more than that of the copywriter. Cream of wheat advertising became synonymous with painting and with the Black mascot chef. Indeed, the company's pre-1925 advertising pictures derived much of their persuasive power through the depiction of the chef as celebrity, servant nurturer, and artistic subject. The company first established a memorable sort of image based upon a photograph of a real missing person, then cut and pasted onto the canvas or paper. Renditions after 1910 continued to be modeled on that same likeness. From our present day vantage point, the advertisements operated at the Black cook's expense, playing upon consumer assumptions about his lowly status, compared to the young white charges often shown alongside him, as you see here on the right. But the ads also had other connotations. Illustrator William V. Cahill, for example, depicted the chef as one who shaped child consumers' understanding of the world. In Building with Blocks, for example, of 1910, a young child accomplishes the completion of a group of picture puzzle blocks that form the image of the cook in front and the words cream of wheat on the side. The composition is bold and uncomplicated. The child in profile, juxtaposed with the iconic image of the cook turned in three-quarter view in pictorial space, offered a powerful triad of gazes. The child focuses attentively on the cook, who in turn offers up cream of wheat to his viewers. The batch of still unassembled blocks on the ground is the only compositional distraction, enabling the viewer to see that the learning is still in process. As the child builds, he comes to see cream of wheat as a crucial building block of life. This is sort of one of the symbolic resonances of what you're seeing here, I'm arguing. So cream of wheat becomes this building block of life, and then all else makes sense in that context. Cahill's cook could shape awareness of the world in part because he was famous. Thus, in some advertisements, the concept of the chef as constructor of knowledge was tied to depictions of him as a celebrity, as an influencer with power to shape culture and serve as the subject of artistic inspiration. In M.L. Blumenthal's When the Wish is Father to the Thought, for example, a young boy gazes, smiling and proud, upon a large oil poster portrait of the chef, who gazes out directly at the viewer. The picture is spare, the message specific. An American viewer in 2022 might well say that as with the elementary school photographer in William Cahill's Look Pleasant, Please, the young white man has mastered the image in the previous one, as here. Today's observer would be mindful of the racial connotation that term mastery invokes. Viewed through a contemporary lens in which concerns about realities of racial injustice are paramount, such an image of artistic command may thus be jarring. Interpreted in light of the historical context of circa 1910, however, the advertisement was fully intended as a positive sell. Cream of wheat evoked through text and cook as oil painting would, as in the previous slide, would inspire America's youth to go out after breakfast and do great things. In Edward Brewer's 1920 Children Looking, the chef has even risen to the pantheon of museum-worthy art. Rendered by painters like Blumenthal, Cahill, and Brewer, the chef is meant to inspire creativity and cultivation. If some ads featured Chef Rastus as inspiration for fine art, others show him as the celebrity subject of a national outdoor advertising campaign. In a trope that was frequently repeated, those chef on billboard in the landscape pictures, one of which you see here, articulated the fluidity of meanings expressed in the cream of wheat advertising of this period. These advertising pictures showcase several themes. One is the national saturation of the brand and product, as well as its artistic ad campaign, so familiar by the 19-teens that the ads could play upon the audience's presumed awareness of that ubiquity. Secondly, although the chef on billboard in the landscape advertisements appeal in earlier eras was deemed to be grounded in amusement and in the chef's congenial presence, a 2022 eye might interpret the omnipresent, incongruously placed pop-up billboards as evidence of a different reality, however inadvertently conveyed, that revealed how racial stereotype and bias also permeated the national fabric. Yet another set of connotations arose in relation to the then current civic controversies over billboards' perceived desecration of the landscape and bill posters' uneasy status on the spectrum between art and commerce. The paintings alluded to the industry-wide debates about the effectiveness of artwork as advertising, about the appropriateness from a sales and marketing standpoint of connecting the two. Some advertising professionals and clients at the time argued that a focus on art and artists, epitomized by the cream of wheat campaign, distracted from the advertising message. I argue that cream of wheat sort of pushed the opposite. I show that the way in which these pictures were painted, with visible reference to the painted surface, which come through really clearly when you see the actual originals in the exhibition. With those references to the painted surface, those serve to reinforce the art aspects and their importance for brand awareness. And yet, for all the path-breaking reliance on the persuasive power of painting, these pictures and the cream of wheat campaign more broadly are baldly transparent about the fact that art was there to sell breakfast cereal. The art message was brilliant marketing, but was ultimately cynical, signified all the more by Rastus's knowing grin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for that fascinating presentation and for all the research you've done to bring it forward. As Michelle said, we were able to secure a number of the original cream of wheat advertisements for the exhibition. And we have a series of ads for quite a number of other corporations, including Aunt Jemima and Maxwell House Coffee and others, which use similar tropes. So we thank you so much for bringing that forward. Our next speaker is Teresa Leininger-Miller, and her topic is, Are They Equal in the Eyes of the Law? African-American Sheet Music of World War I, for which she also wrote an essay for the catalog. Thank you, Teresa.
You're welcome. Can you see the slideshow?
No, we can't.
Okay, I pulled it up on my screen, so I'm not sure what else to do.
Hit share screen.
Okay, hang on a second.
Sure. Share screen down at the bottom.
Got it. There we go. Now you can see it?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay. I started this project in the teens to work on the commemoration of World War I. And at that time, I wrote papers on Red Cross nurses and mothers of soldiers and sheet music. And then I also worked on this topic. From the late 19th century through the 1940s, most sheet music in the United States featured alluring illustrated title pages, often in bold, contrasting colors, meant to attract buyers. Middle-class women performed the songs on home pianos for entertainment, comfort, and hope while men served abroad. Sheet music covers with a wide spectrum of images expressed a nuanced range of attitudes and emotions about Black male soldiers, including patriotism, courage, fear, pride, racism, and tension. I argue that racially uplifting images of Black servicemen express the desire that equality in the United States would be achieved after the Great War for Democracy. Dominant themes emphasize a proud familial legacy of self-sacrifice, interracial camaraderie, musical ability, and combat soldiers. White visual artists were more progressive than white songwriters, often overriding disparaging lyrics with more positive or inclusive imagery, while Black songwriters were more assertive than white composers and illustrators in the push for equal rights. Of 3.7 million US soldiers in World War I, 370,000 were Black. They trained and deployed in segregated units, and 42,000 saw Army combat under white officers. Both Black men, both enlisted and drafted, served in the American Expeditionary Forces comprising labor, stevedore, and engineer service battalions, and some worked as musicians. The first of four major themes that I addressed today is interracial camaraderie. The sheet music for "We're All Comrades Now" depicts a mammoth Uncle Sam smiling benevolently as he looks down at 5 married doughboys. The verses declare, "All nationalities are falling in line that they used to quarrel before. They're friends since our nation's at war." Ethnically stereotyped names in the lyrics listed here suggest a European American melting pot. Bill Bailey may indicate the sole Black soldier that Andre de Tuckage inserted in his cover design. The historical reality did not match the illustrator's vision. The U.S. Armed Forces were not officially desegregated until 1948. In World War I, Black troops fought under white officers, but not with white Americans. Several songs highlight both comradeship and multi-generational service. In "The Brown-Skinned Boys Are Coming," African-American songwriter George Lewis recalls Black service in the Spanish-American War. "We'll duplicate what we did in '98. On the cover, 3 soldiers, 2 armed with bayoneted rifles, cheerfully follow an American flag bearer into battle, seemingly oblivious to the exploding shell above. Lewis underscores their doggedness with lyrics that say, "We won't lag behind," and "We have never been found wanting." And he highlights their interracial conviviality. They are going to join the white boys and have one hot old time. The dialect song, "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Slacker," concerns loved ones who insist that Stephen Jackson Washington joined the Army because his father fought in the Civil War. Instead of depicting the fearful draft-dodging Washington hiding in a haystack, as the lyrics state, the cover shows his parents and a new wife bidding the proud uniformed man farewell. Notable differences of skin color, hairstyles, and fashions of the generations indicate distinctions: old, new, rural, urban, and segregated, assimilated. In 1918, Edward Wrench produced a recruitment poster with the title echoing that of this song, "Colored Man is No Slacker." Both music publishers and military recruiters used similar advertising and marketing strategies with propagandistic imagery. For "When the Good Lord Makes a Record of a Hero's Deed, He Draws No Color Line," Edgar Keller drew a naturalistic half-length illustration in which a parent and child look into each other's eyes solemnly. The framing orange military shield and the soldier's uniform with its neckband emblazoned USA underscore patriotism. Lyricist Val Traynor encourages Black Americans to enlist in the military by associating service with morality. He attributes to this couple the belief that Army duty would ensure the young man's favorable afterlife. The long tradition of African-American military service was evoked again in World War II on the cover of "We Are Americans Too" by African-American songwriters Razaf Blake and Cook, published by the Black New York City firm Handy Brothers Music Company, and you can see it in the background on the right. The illustrator depicted a line of soldiers, 3 abreast, sending a hill beneath a starry sky. In the first row marched men in uniforms from the Civil War, Revolutionary War, and World War I. A third theme is military musicians. "He Draws No Color Line" is dedicated to Lieutenant Reese Europe, an African-American conductor who led the band of the U.S. 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. Partially because of Reese's fame, several sheet music covers featured Black drum majors, such as these. Yet stereotypical titles and physical caricatures from blackface minstrelsy linger. These pieces suggest that African Americans' war involvement was limited to musical performances, mostly in the US. When Uncle Joe Steps into France differs in that the cover by E.H. Pfeiffer is set in Paris. In the background is the Eiffel Tower and a red, white, and blue shield initialed RF, which stands for République Française. The drum major is coded as Black by the stereotyped name in the song title and his slightly deeper skin tone than the men he leads. It seems that Pfeiffer tried to downplay such racist lyrics as, each one has a razor in his boot. These sons of hams are feeling fit. They're going to cut up quite a bit. African-American songwriters Henry Kramer and Turner Layton countered the messages of minstrel so-called coon songs with Goodbye Alexander, Goodbye Honey Boy. E.E. Walton drew the cover to reflect the lyrics about Dinah Lee waving to her drafted sweetie, Alexander Cooper, in this urban scene of skyscrapers bedecked with American and French flags. Verses echo common World War I themes, the longing of those at home for the soldiers' return, pride in their service, and belief in success. The cover of When Our Brown-Skinned Soldier Boys Come Home from War depicts a victorious return of infantrymen led by an African-American band. Griffin Music House, a Black-owned Chicago company, published this song by African-American songwriter Porter Granger. Just above a bystander's hat, a banner identifies the distant troops as the 8th Infantry Regiment of the Illinois National Guard, a Chicago-based militia founded in the 1870s. In World War I, the 8th Illinois was redesignated as the U.S. 370th Infantry and fought under the French, one of just 2 Black combat divisions at the time. And this is a monument to the troops in Chicago. Typically, the Blue Star service flag featured 1 star for each family member. In this version in the middle, with 15 stars, the emblem may represent those from a wider community that wish to express pride in military service. My last theme today is combat soldiers in the fight for equality. The boldest cover representing an African-American combat soldier, when Rastus Johnson cakewalks through Berlin, features a giant Black warrior on tiptoe, uplifting a diminutive slumped German, Kaiser Wilhelm II, with one fist, threatening him with a straight razor in the other. The cover is a dynamic image of battlefield domination, with a muscular doughboy crouching on tiptoe in a barren black and orange abstract landscape with a diagonal horizon under a cloudy blue sky. The illustration coincides with the lyrics, only in that Rastus Johnson from Alabama is described as a fit dancer, a dream of grace at minuet, a roll, or grand salaam. However, both cover and words celebrate Johnson's prowess as one of the chosen men of General John Pershing. Albert Wilfred Barbell's illustration may depict either Private William Johnson or Private Needham Roberts, both of whom in 1918 fought off a 20-man German patrol while on guard duty and severely wounded in France. The 2 men earned the Croix de Guerre and a posthumous Purple Heart, and in 2015, President Barack Obama awarded Johnson the Medal of Honor. Wrench depicted the warriors in a dramatic moonlit hand-to-hand combat scene in Our Colored Heroes, one man stabbing a German with a bolo knife. Composer John Atkinson riffed on the cakewalk in When Rastus Johnson, reclaiming, reinterpreting, and elevating its meaning. Once danced among enslaved African Americans and meant to covertly mock white slaveholders, the cakewalk was adapted by white performers unaware of the mockery in the minstrel shows beginning in the 1870s. Playwright Amiri Baraka declared, "I find the idea of white minstrels in blackface satirizing a dance, satirizing themselves, a remarkable kind of irony." As a masterful Black combatant, Rastus Johnson is the antithesis of the anonymous white common soldiers standing at parade rest in thousands of World War I sculptural monuments. In 1918, U.S. Representative Leonidas Dyer, a Republican from St. Louis, introduced the Dyer anti-lynching bill to mandate punishment for lynchings and mob violence. The House of Representatives passed the Dyer bill in 1922, but the Senate did not. In the 1930s, the Costigan-Wagner bill also addressed lynching. In fact, from 1882 to 1968, nearly 200 anti-lynching bills were introduced to the Congress, but the Senate approved none. In 2018, the Senate unanimously passed the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act, but the bill failed to pass the House. In 2020, the revision of this legislation, the Emmett Till anti-lynching bill, passed the House of Representatives but stalled over language. Finally, this year, Congress approved a version and President Biden signed it on March 29th. W.E.B. Du Bois, editor of the NAACP's journal, The Crisis, supported African-American combat soldiers. After the war in May 1919, he argued for the continued struggle for equality, declaring, "We are cowards if now that the war is over, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. We return. We return from fighting. We return fighting." That fight was evident in the bloody race riots across the United States in 1919, a period known as the Red Summer. The ongoing combat was the subject of two of the most compelling pieces of sheet music featuring Black World War I soldiers, Please Let Your Light Shine on Me and Are They Equal in the Eyes of the Law, both self-published in 1919 by African-American songwriters in Memphis. The first cover depicts a Black soldier with arms outstretched toward the Statue of Liberty, whose torch shines away from him and onto a tree for African Americans as compensation for having served in France. On the latter song's cover, in the background is a vignette of a Black soldier in a battlefield charge. In the foreground, a blindfolded white female justice presents a balanced scale holding two seated infantrymen, one white, one Black. The chorus declares, "They were the same in no man's land," and asks, "Tell me now, how do they stand?" While white visual artists were generally more progressive and inclusive in their visions of songs than white lyricists, Black songwriters went even further. They not only portrayed African-American soldiers as patriotic and valiant, but also underscored their combat service abroad to lobby for improved legal status back home during and after the war, with both their rousing lyrics and their commissions of persuasive music covers such as these. My work on race in this medium continues at Auburn University next month, where I will examine sheet music by Lily Ukulani, the Queen of Hawaii, and W.C. Handy, the father of the blues. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you so much for that enlightening presentation. I'll just mention that Teresa has an extensive collection of sheet music, and we are fortunate to have some of that in the exhibition, Imprinted, Illustrating Race. And our next presentation is featuring Leonard Davis, who will talk about his remarkable collection of Black Americana, much of which are, or some pieces, fortunately, of which are featured at the museum. Leonard, welcome. Hi, Leonard. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's great.
And you can see that some of his collections are right behind him.
Well, strategically and for purpose. Welcome, everyone. Thank you. And thank you for the wonderful introduction and for my inclusion in this conversation. I'd like to begin with a statement that I learned from my mentor, Miss Elizabeth Metters. Kiss to you. She has been my guide throughout my journey so far of collecting. She has the most extensive, comprehensive collection in the world. She told me something that I'll never forget. It has been a guide for me. History without documentation is just folklore. That statement has informed my collecting throughout. Let me explain why, and I'll show you my journey. I first started collecting in the 80s. When I got my first apartment, I wanted to decorate my home with images and artifacts that reflected the African-American aesthetic. I wanted to have rare, valuable artifacts that celebrated the triumphs and the achievements of African-American people. I wanted everyone that entered into my apartment to know immediately that this is the home of an African-American person, for sure. When I started my search, the first items that I ran across were ceramic items like cookie jars, ashtrays, salt and pepper shakers, tray cards, sheet music, stuff like that. And I was told that these were rare, pricey, highly sought after collectibles. And I was also led to believe that these items represented Black heritage. Along the first rare items that I acquired was an Aunt Jemima Mammy cookie jar. And I'll just share the screen and just show you what I'm talking about, okay? This is a mosaic tile cookie jar that originally appeared in 1943 for the Mosaic Tile Ceramic Company. And this jar is worth $600 at this point. And there are various other versions of it that are even worth even more, you know. This is sheet music from the from the Gold Dust Twins and one of their advertisements. Now, the Gold Dust Twins advertisements in the washing powder featured Goldie and Dusty. And their slogan was, let the Gold Dust Twins do your washing for you. Let them wash everything that's black and dirty, white and clean. And unfortunately, they represented black and dirty. This is from the Coon Chicken Inn restaurant. It emerged between 1925 and 1931. They had 3 locations: Salt Lake City, Utah, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon. They used the coon image there, and they felt that that logo promoted the authenticity of Southern style cooking. You can see on the photograph there that you enter into the restaurant through the mouth of the coon image. These are just a few examples of some of the things that I collected in my journey. Let's see, no, how do we go back?
How do we close?
It stops here.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So here, there we go. So during the time I started going to antique malls, auctions, collector shows, and along the journey, I met advanced collectors that taught me about the importance of preserving the history of Africans in America. I started learning about Black inventors, artists, doctors, activists, and politicians, and collecting artifacts that honored the legacy of pioneers in the Black experience that have been hidden, overlooked, or just merely forgotten. Such things as this. Here we go. This is an original can of hair preparation from the iconic, the one and only Madam C.J. Walker. She's the first female self-made millionaire in America. Can you believe that I am holding in my hand a piece of history, and how personal it is because it's African-American, belongs to me? Okay, I'll keep going. Let me show you another iconic figure. Josephine Baker, in French, Josephine Baker. I love her. She is one of my most prized possessions. Josephine Baker, the statue, the felt hair, okay, the banana skirt, and all. This is my love, one of my most cherished possessions. I got this at the French flea market, Marché à Puce. This is a really important replica of the Martin Luther King Memorial in Washington, D.C. It has all the insignia on the sides or whatever, exact scale model of the museum in Washington, D.C., the memorial. These are collectibles that are so valuable and so important to have in a collection. A few years ago, I came to realize that my collection consisted of many rare and valuable items. Some revealed the evidence of the existence of real people and their achievements, and others were fictitious stereotypes that never existed, but strangely, they were perceived as real people. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Okay. In 1819, the Pearl Milling Company, okay, created the mascot, Aunt Jemima, to sell pancake mix. In 1963, the McDonald Corporation created Ronald McDonald, a mascot to sell hamburgers. So we have Aunt Jemima and we have McDonald's, Ronald McDonald, mascots. Okay. Willard Scott was hired to be the first Ronald McDonald. You know Willard Scott, we all love Willard Scott. He was a weatherman, and in fact, Willard Scott was the first Bozo the Clown. And he created Ronald McDonald. He was the first person to don the outfit of Ronald McDonald. And similarly, the Pancake Company, Aunt Jemima, the milling company, hired this woman, Nancy Green. She was the first person to impersonate Aunt Jemima, the mascot, Aunt Jemima. An image, okay, both of these are iconic, okay, images that were what? Okay, mascots created to sell a product. Now let me ask you a question. Did the Willard Scott, using example, this is what I want you to do. Did the Ronald McDonald image indicate that white people are all clowns? No. Did the Aunt Jemima image indicate that all Black people are maids, cooks, and servants? No. They're mascots that were created to produce, to sell products, just mascots, fictitious mascots, images that never existed. As a matter of fact, Black people have never been pickaninnies, coons, mammies, sambos, jiggers, niggers, none of those things. These are all names and images that were created to humiliate, marginalize, and disparage Black people. And back in 1945, several advocacy groups such as the NAACP protested and demanded that the derogatory depictions of African Americans would no longer be tolerated. Okay, I digress. Very often people ask me the question, where did these objects come from and who made them? I tell them that these derogatory objects emerged after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in 1865. Historians say that these depictions of African Americans were created to reflect the resentment and intense anger of some white Americans, especially in the South, that were being forced to live in a free society. Question number 2, what purpose do these serve? Well, these manual collectibles should be used as tools to educate us about a dark period in American history. And now these objects serve as sentinels, warning us never to let this happen again. Why do you collect and display these images in your home if you have all of this history about derogatory images? And it's a likely question. My answer, I collect to preserve these objects for future generations to see. As I told you, history without evidence is just legend. The racist images should not be destroyed. These images provide tangible proof this period in American history did take place, especially now with the recent removal of Aunt Jemima from the shelves of grocery stores. Okay. Okay, now let's smile for a minute. Have you ever seen this collectible? The Obamas at the White House, the salt and pepper shakers, and then what's considered nodders. I love this. And you know what it reminds me of? I remember at the Democratic National Convention, Michelle Obama said, and I quote, "Every morning I wake up in a house that was built by slaves." What did she say? Has she lost her mind? What did she do? Historians went bananas. Everybody went running for their research. Everybody and then they slowly came walking back. Not only did they build the White House, they also built the Capitol. Get back to me. Evidence, it's important. It's all we have to go on. I'm going to end with this. My love, my love, my love. Do you know her? Esther Jones. She was actually known as Little Baby Esther. That was her stage name. She was the inspiration for the one and only Betty Boop. She was a performer, a vaudevillian performer that performed during the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s at nightclubs like the Cotton Club in Harlem. She was best known for the unique way she ended all of her performances. Have you ever, you know what I'm talking about? Betty Boop, you ever see her style? Okay, I'm gonna give you an example. Here we go. Let's see if I can do it right. Here's how she always ended. Boppity, 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 bop. Boop, boopy doo. Thank you.
Leonard, thank you so much for that just wonderful presentation and for placing all those fascinating objects in important context in your unique and phenomenal way. You can see what a joy Leonard has been to work with and all of our speakers this morning. So we thank you all, and we're going to bring you all back for a little bit of conversation. Okay, I think we have everybody on camera. Great.
And if people would post any questions that you have in the chat, that would be appreciated. There's one in there already.
Yeah, we have a terrific question from James Kimball. Jim is a professor at Seton Hall University, and he worked very closely with us to organize an international traveling exhibition that we did at the Norman Rockwell Museum and beyond, focusing on the 4 freedoms. Jim asks, and this is a very meaningful question, I think. He says, this is proving to be a thoughtful discussion. For the panelists who use some of the imagery, some of this imagery in the classroom, I'm wondering about any specific ways that you prepare students for appropriate discussions that remain respectful and avoid the perpetuation of stereotypes. Thank you, Jim, for that question. Would anybody like to jump in and talk about that? Michelle?
Well, I'm not teaching now, but in the past I taught a course. It was called Arts for the Public, and it dealt with a range of different kinds of popular imagery. And I think now I'd probably have to do it differently, but I had several classes that were devoted to racial imagery. And the thing was that my students had never seen any of this stuff. So, I mean, they didn't know what Little Rascals were. They didn't know, anything of the sort that we all have been showing. And thank God for Leonard Davis collecting all this stuff. So, I mean, I would basically use the class as a way of showing them this material, and I said, this stuff is offensive, or you're going to see it as offensive, and if anybody is deeply offended or traumatized or anything like that, you can leave the classroom. I mean, I didn't know what else to say. And this was before 2020. I mean, this was like in the 2010 to 2019. So I'll let others who are more engaged now, but just to say that they'd never seen any of this. And I felt that it was really important that they see it.
Thank you, Michelle. Anybody else like to comment on that question?
Yeah, I can say, just a reminder, I'm speaking to all of you from Texas, and teaching in Texas is a really interesting experiment because there's the population that probably fulfills everyone's expectations of Texas. And then there's the Texas and Houston where I am, which is, it's one of the fastest growing states. Houston is a minority urban population. My campus is a majority minority campus. And a lot of times I just kind of step back and let the students have their own conversation, because they represent a diversity of voices and they work things out between themselves, and they don't necessarily all come to consensus, but I think they learn from encountering each other. And I think all of us as people who work with visual images are uniquely privileged to have this conversation, because it's a lot easier to talk with images, because they see it right away. And these today's generation are such proficient image users, right? So, it's a lot easier to teach with images than I think like traditional narrative history as well. So I feel grateful every day that we can always, as Leonard points out, fight back through evidence.
Yeah, and also, I also teach at the Fashion Institute, which is an art school, and primarily we're all visual learners. So, I'm not surrounded by a lot of intellectual or pseudo intellectuals or any of the above who really are trying to get their PhDs or whatever. We're just trying to be artists and have fun in most cases. And so they react to what they see and what is tactile that they can handle and look at. I try to remove the anger aspect of it. I try not to express that this is a reason for division, okay? Or for us to continue with something that has happened in the past. It's over. Like the Holocaust, it in its own way, it's another version. It's an American Holocaust. It happened, okay? So there's no, this is not a point for friction, but it's a learning experience, yes. It's something that we should all know. And I've got kids that are asking me, 19 and 20-year-olds asking me, Miss Butterworth, now where does she live?
Oh, wow. Wow.
I'm worried about Aunt Jemima. And so with the disappearance of Aunt Jemima, Miss Butterworth, syrup that's in a brown bottle, they think that that's an actual person. I've got students that are struggling to say that there's a guy that my mom said that was really popular back in the day, and I'm thinking Jackie Wilson. I'm thinking what? No, and ultimately Michael Jackson. 19-year-olds who going, that guy. Oh yeah, back in the day. Well, for them, that was back in the day. So yes, we have to share this information with you, and that's why I express that I feel that I'm a custodian. It's not for everybody, but to share, to collect, and to hold on to some of these images and actual items to be able to show generations in the future, what they actually were or the history about it. And not only from this particular, but personal, family Bibles, family photographs to learn, to cultivate, to hold on and pass them down to the generations so you can see your ancestors, okay? See their faces and engage with them, which is really so enlightening and so valuable to individuals for just their own self-esteem, to know that their great parents were people of means, people that were prominent. It really raises people's self-esteem, to know that. So that's why I think it's important. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I think in the learning process, that's what's important.
Thank you. That's a wonderful response.
Thank you,
Teresa,
Leonard.
do you have a perspective on that?
Thanks, I do. I show students the sheet music in the classroom so that they can physically hold it and understand what it meant to put that on view on a home piano where it was visible constantly, how that would affect people on a daily basis. But nowadays, I also include a content warning on the syllabus that we are going to be addressing serious, mature material. And same thing as Michelle, that if they feel uncomfortable with it, they should talk to me, that we should have a conversation, that there's also the psychological services on campus that's ready to help. But I think it makes a huge difference for students to physically handle the material and realize that this had a profound effect on people's daily lives.
Could I also say one thing too? I'm sorry, just to interrupt, but just
Of
to
course.
say, a lot of my students are interracial. And that creates a little bit of a conflict for a lot of people because, well, I don't want to, my mom is white. My dad is African-American. I don't know where I fit in. I don't know, and to help them to come to some terms and some understanding about their family makeup. and where they fit in the world. You know, that is somehow a conflict for a lot of students of today that we have, you know, and various other mixes. My mom is Asian. My dad is this, my mom is, you know, whatever. And so those, they're not anomalies anymore. They're the real, what is the current makeup of a lot of American families. And so as instructors, that's something that we also have to come to explain and try to bring them into a better understanding of themselves and the makeup of what is now today's America.
Thank you, Leonard. That's an important perspective. Robin and I certainly had many discussions about this question as we were organizing the exhibition. I'm wondering, Heather, from a museum curator's perspective, if you have thoughts, because I know that you recently went through, you know, as we all are, rethinking the way that we talk about the works that we have and the way that we contextualize them.
Yes, so we thought a lot and tested a lot with our audiences, how people would respond to language around difficult images of race. And the thing that became most clear, most early, and some of you, I think, participated in conversations around this, was that it had to be more than a label. People are visual. People who come to art museums are visual. They're not gonna, if they're taken aback by the image, a small label next to it explaining the context, explaining that, yes, this is obviously a racist image and part of a tradition, wasn't the answer. So we ended up commissioning a video that, again, some people here were nice enough to contribute to. And again, just to have a bigger frame for this work in order so that people could, and it was very important not to place it in a gallery in a place where you could be surprised by it either. It didn't want it to be without context or to be a surprise. And overall, we've had pretty good responses to that.
Great, thank you so much. And Robin, how about you? I know certainly when we were working on the exhibition, there was a lot of discussion about how to display this very derogatory and challenging imagery, and you know, how to help visitors to understand where it fit in. But you also work with students, so I don't know if you want to think about this question from both angles.
Well, from the student standpoint, well, I would say from both, I lead with the narrative and the facts. You know, there's a truth that doesn't waver, you know, no matter what you're talking about. So with the exhibition, it was about the facts. It was about, you know, these are artifacts that existed because someone created them, someone commissioned them. I mean, that commissioning of the imagery, you know, was true and factual. And so when I talk to students, you know, it's all in that vein of the factual happening, the dates, the illustrators, the art directors. And so even, you know, with the show, the way that we laid it out and the way, you know, it was always a timeline, really, a timeline of this happened and then this happened and this happened because, you know, illustrators responded to events in history. There was always a, you know, response to what was going on. Whether people agreed or not, there was a visual response to it.
Great, thank you. Wonderful response. There's a specific question for you, Leonard. What has been your process for selecting items in your collection, and do you have a criteria?
Oh, you know what, to follow typically for collectors, the first notion, of course, is value. Because what in fact you're doing is you're investing in these collectibles, and they're sitting there as you're admiring them, but they still should be appreciating as you admire them. And ultimately, one of these days, you're going to have to let it go. Maybe when I'm 80, maybe when I'm 200. But at some point, you're going to have to start to realize, okay, you know, I'm old and decrepit now, and my family doesn't want to be bothered with these things, do something with them, okay? And that day ultimately comes. So that point, you don't want an item that you bought for $5 and it's been sitting there for 20 years and it's still only worth $5. So it's appreciating in value your collections. I mean, that's just the lesson of all things that you're investing in. If it's baseball cards or whatever it is, you bought them as part of your collection, and it's supposed to be, you know what I'm saying, increasing in value as you have it. It's a good or bad investment. So that is part of the selection process. If I've answered the question, yes.
Thank you, Leonard. That's great. Ayana asks, kind of moving from James Kimball's question regarding the use of these images or sharing these images with students. You know, basically, what is their reaction? Or is there, you know, a sense of deeply ingrained racism there that drove the imagery? Do they think about these things very differently? Do they, you know, recognize the harm that they created? Does anybody want to jump in on that? Karen, do you have a sense of that?
Of like the racism that was driving the images?
Yeah, I guess maybe maybe our questioner is asking a little bit about student reaction to seeing images of this sort.
I mean, I think, you know, this goes back to what I was speaking about. I think for Chinese exclusion, the images are so powerful because the effect of exclusion has been to create a national, a collective lack of, collective unawareness of America's policy, systemic policy against ethnic Asians. Right. And so, you know, that was my point basically, is that, you know, what Imprinted does wonderfully as an exhibit is sort of remind us of how race has been structured through images, you know, but a lot of times, like the sort of role in which African-American history has been constructed has been widely documented, both good and bad. And that's something that America has always been aware of, right? So one example as a film scholar I always use is Birth of a Nation, the D.W. Griffith film, right? Which now, of course, you know, is a seminal film in the emergence of Hollywood filmmaking. It's also a deeply problematic film, right? Because of the representation of the Ku Klux Klan. But nevertheless, what's important is we have this, you know, landmark visual text about literally about American history and within American history, which like makes explicit the ways in which slavery was central to the American origin story. Right now, what do we have about Asian Americans? Right. Well, I go back to the golden spike image. Right. The only image that the iconic image of the Asian contribution to also to American national mythology is one in which Asians are systemically erased. Right. And so definitely, I think for educating Americans at large about racism, these images are incredibly powerful, you know, and it's again, to go back to my, you know, again, what I'm trying to say is like, what we're educating them is not just about like the actual historical process, right? To show that it happened, to show that it was intentional, right? Which is in itself an important lesson, but also to show that like consequences of the lesson is that we don't know at all, right? Which is very different from the African-American lesson.
Thank you for that perspective.
Could I just throw in one more last thing?
Sure.
The lesson that I'm trying to teach to my students and perhaps all of us is we're not trying to exclude anybody. It's inclusion.
Yes.
Just trying to say we were here too.
Yeah. Yes, and just to follow up on that, Leonard, you know, one of the things I really appreciated, you know, in the conversation that we all had about Imprinted, Stephanie and Jenna and Robin, you know, and I remember one of these early conversations where people, I think Teresa had brought this up, like, well, to what extent, how comprehensive can any exhibit be when we're dealing with race? I mean, the very nature of America is that it's so diverse. How can we possibly effectively cover everything, right? And so, I felt so privileged to be talking about Asian American representation because, again, so much of what I'm trying to do is to counteract that erasure. But, I'm not trying to argue for, forget them, think about us. What I'm trying to argue is like, let's all be a little bit more sophisticated in the ways in which we think about visual representation.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one or two more quick questions.
There's someone from Amsterdam, Stephanie.
Yes. Which artists are currently the ones to watch in terms of respecting the past and shaping the future? And that is greetings from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Anybody want to offer some thoughts about that? We will have actually this afternoon some terrific artists on a panel, so we'll look forward to that. But if you have further thoughts, fortunately we have lots of wonderful contemporary artists working on these themes right now and creating a sense of inclusion and equity. But jump in.
Everybody knows this is the 50th year, the 50th anniversary of hip hop. And it's going to be celebrated all over the place. The breakdancing, graffiti, boom boxes, all kinds of things.
New museum in the Bronx, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
So,
See who's going to be in there.
you're going to see an outbreak of all of the hip hop artists from the past coming forward now, sharing their stories and their history about the birth of hip hop, which many people said wouldn't last. Incredible, incredible stories. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah. The fact that there's a museum is incredible.
And there's a museum about racist imagery in Michigan, the Jim Crow Museum, which has a huge collection of memorabilia. So well visiting.
Right, Dr. Pilgrim.
Great. Thank you. And one last question for Michelle, actually. Why do you think Cream of Wheat, and this is from Lauren, why do you think Cream of Wheat was so totally focused on the Black chef? How did it benefit their merchandising from their point of view?
Well, they actually did have other kinds of imagery, but I just focused on the chef one. But the chef was the dominant one, and it was the dominant one because it was effective. It sold the cereal. I mean, this was this bland, kind of off-white colored, sandy kind of tasting cereal, and
Porridge. Porridge.
Yeah, porridge. It was porridge, and it sold, and even the Mapes, the president of the company and stuff. I mean, they said that the chef, the chef appealed to people on a very human level. So, I mean, that was his argument, and he kind of bolstered it with some points about some of the people that were writing and asking for pictures and things like that. But I think he had a point there. I mean, that the chef was seen as this congenial mascot, the way that in other ways Aunt Jemima was, and other mascots like was Ronald McDonald much later and stuff. But people were not looking at these. A lot of people were not looking at these in the way that they do now, and so it clearly was effective, and that's why they kept using it. People liked it.
Right, just the way advertising is today, right?
Yeah.
Well, we thank you all for your incredible insights. I'll just say that we had the privilege of working with these panelists for more than a year prior to the opening of Imprinted on a series of meetings where they contributed tremendous wisdom, expertise, guidance, ideas, inspiration. We thank you all so much for your contributions, and you can see that the scholarship that emerged is quite important.